trust you've all followed Grant's instructions and that you're well fed to keep you going for the next couple of hours. So we are going to have a sort of fairly interactive panel discussion following the really good presentations that we had before the coffee break. And in fact, Jan's presentation in particular reminded me of something I saw on Twitter, which was a statistic that the number of people who understand blockchain in the past year has rocketed from 2 to an incredible 3. And who knows, maybe by the end of today's conference, we'll get up to 4. So on behalf of the panel, it's a pleasure for us to be here. And you'll see from the topic that we're going to be looking at some blockchain and related issues at quite a high level. And in fact, the panel after us will be looking at some of the IP issues a bit more specifically. So we'll do our best not to trespass on their territory too much. We had 3 really good presentations, I think, before the coffee break. So we're going to just change gear a little bit. We won't have any slides. We will have some great comments, I'm sure, from our 4 panelists. So without further ado, I'm just going to briefly introduce the panel to you. So on my far left here is Marieke Flamont, who you've already heard from, of course, and she's Managing Director of Circle UK. And hopefully we can pick up on some of your comments from earlier on during the discussion. And then I'm delighted we have Benoit Abelouge, who is from the European Commission, DG Connect, where he works on blockchain and fintech. And he's particularly interested in issues around standardization, interoperability, and infrastructure. And then on my right is Erich Spangenberg, who is CEO and founder of IPwe, which, as we'll hear, is a blockchain business. Has a very interesting background in IP and patents, in wearing different hats, asserting patents and challenging patents as well. He's now based in Paris, but he's not wearing a yellow shirt today. And then right at the end is John Wright, who is with the law firm Stern Kessler in Washington, DC, where he focuses on litigation and appeals, and is also co-leader of the firm's blockchain practice. So brings a great perspective from the US to these issues. So that is our panel. We've identified some questions which we're going to try and tackle in the time that we have. We'll also be great to have some questions and comments from the audience as well. We'll keep some time at the end for that, but if you have anything really pressing or you want to challenge anything that any of our panelists have said, do let us know. Raise your hand and we'll try and catch my eye and we'll do our best to bring you in. So I'm actually going to start with Erich. You recently founded a blockchain business in the patent area. Why do that? Why do you think blockchain is important? What impact do you think it will have? And what do you see the relationship being between blockchain and AI, Erich?
Yeah, so, does this work? Yeah. My touch on blockchains didn't start really until 2015. And when I first saw it, I didn't understand the difference between... Working now? Yeah. So didn't understand the difference between Bitcoin. Yeah.
Try that.
Yeah. Bitcoin and blockchain, but eventually what happened is that after about a year thinking about it, I thought that one of the things that drove me crazy was keeping track of title in the patent space. So when I was a troll, I would spend $30,000 to hire some lawyer who would tell me what the technology was roughly about, whether or not they thought perhaps it could be valid, and maybe who owned it. And those 5 or 6 page letters then turned out to be completely worthless. So the thought is that the title piece is something that blockchain would be particularly helpful with, and you can get into the off-blockchain problems with diamonds and other things. Patents don't suffer from that. And then you could use the AI piece so that normal people could actually begin to get a better understanding, and then you could give them a mathematical probability of the validity or invalidity of the patent, and voila, you'd have a much easier entrance point to the asset class. And fundamentally, that's been the problem with the asset class for the past, well, for a very long time.
And what's wrong with the way that we manage patents at the moment? What's wrong with the...
Just look at the WIPO statistics of 2% transact and maybe 5% find their way into products. So you have the problems from large patent owners whose very significant percentage of their patent portfolio isn't worth the paper it's written on, to the fact that if you the good patents actually those that don't necessarily ever find the light of day. So look, you don't have to just measure ROI on a return on cash basis, but you could say jobs created, benefit for society, whatever metric you'd like to take. And I think that most people would agree that the ROI on patents is ridiculously low. And so I think that the blockchain and AI piece has the ability to change that, fundamentally change it.
And do you think blockchain and AI can supplement the existing systems we have for patent registration and so on, or will they replace it eventually?
Yeah, I think so. Two things. On something as simple as title, it should just replace it. I mean, you couldn't come up with a more complicated system having dual ownership or multi-ownership, owning. When you tokenize it, you can own a piece in the licensing revenue, but not title, or you can have a piece of the title. So there's all kinds of cool things you could do. And on the AI piece, that no one should feel threatened by. All that's happening is that AI is bringing back to your laptop the work you weren't going to get anyway, and doing it much more efficiently. So I think both those things are fundamentally significant for the patent space and will improve the mechanical stuff. Whether or not the stuff that Jort was talking about today, I don't think examiners' jobs are ever going to get eliminated. I think that you're going to need that certainly for some long period of time, that input. But certainly it can make it more efficient so they can focus in on the pieces of art they should be looking at.
So you don't want to put the EPA out of business then?
No. I think they play an important function, and I think that prosecuting lawyers in particular who, over the past, at least since I've been in the space in 2003, have gotten pushed out of the way by the wrong people, primarily litigators. I think this is an opportunity for the prosecution types to reassert themselves and assume the position that they should assume. They play an important role in the system.
Okay. That's, I think, an example, isn't it, of the kind of implementation that you were talking about, Marika, in your presentation. I mean, does that seem to you like a reasonable use of blockchain, where it could have practical effect?
Yeah, absolutely. I think definitely sounds reasonable. I think I really like also the sound of, if you put AI plus blockchain together, what happens, right? And in this world that we actually touch upon, which is tokenization of everything, when actually if you can have, formulas and machine between themselves to actually decide what microtransactions need to happen, I think it becomes extremely powerful and pushed through. And I think indeed for the patenting industry in general, rather than thinking, which jobs are going to be taken away, I think it's also like, we saw today how complicated it is to actually do some searches and queries and actually get to the right rationale. I think this is just going to become more and more complex. So actually having a part of that is automated and that can be done in a seamless way to then add the additional layers of human intelligence on it and the substance and the small details that will make it even more relevant is super important. So I think it will definitely have a very large impact, and being ready for it and preparing for it is indeed very necessary.
Okay. Now, Benoit, we've heard this morning about the really fast pace of development in this area. You're working at the European Commission. Obviously, there's the opportunity to try and regulate this space. I mean, how on earth do you go about that, and what kind of role do you think the European Commission or other similar bodies should play in trying to regulate this area?
Before jumping to regulation, I think that everything started, as everybody knows, with blockchain and the so-called cryptocurrencies, which we prefer to call crypto assets. And the first look at this new phenomenon by the European Parliament and the ECB was about, does it threat the financial system or not? And do we have to make something about that? And the first result, that was the first report issued by the Parliament. And then they realized that the underlying technology below that could have a big impact on the financial system. So there was another attempt to then look at the impact of these new technologies, blockchain and AI, and on the financial systems. And that's where the Parliament mandated the Commission to create a fintech task force, and that's where we really started to analyze blockchain as a phenomenon, as a technology, which could not only be used in the financial system, but in all industries. And that was very well demonstrated by Marika and Claire before. And so And so looking at the potential of that technology, and the Parliament was very clear as well in his conclusions that we need to let innovation to happen, not to regulate too quickly, and really monitor, look at how the innovation is going on, and really let that technology first mature and go to its full potential before thinking about regulation. And now we are at a point where we are thinking about different aspects, and talking about the role of the Commission. So as I said, there's a political momentum with the Parliament mandating the Commission to really look into blockchain. We see it as a foundational technology for the next generation internet. We talk about Internet of Trust, Internet of Value, Internet of Truth. And we need as well as a Commission to try to solve some of the issues or the challenges with Internet today, such as the central platforms which are too powerful, etc., and that winner takes it all kind of phenomenon. So we see the economic opportunity for Europe to seize that opportunity and to lead this paradigm shift from central platforms to distributed ones. And we think as well, and that's where we start into analyzing. We are already on our way to that, to analyze the legal aspects of a blockchain implementation. We know, and you probably have heard, that there are some tensions between blockchain and the GDPR, and I invite and warmly invite everyone to read the thematic report that was produced by the European Blockchain Observatory on that topic, to clearly demonstrate that, I mean, at least say that there's no fundamental contradiction between the technology as such and the GDPR. There may be implementation of blockchain which may be GDPR compliant or not. There are other regulations like EIDAS related to identity management, network information security, AML, etc., etc. So there's a real work to and that is going on to really analyze the EU legal framework and to see whether it's technology neutral and whether there are things that we need to fix there. So that work is going on. And then, as I said, there's an economic opportunity, and we see as well the Commission and the Member States together to play the role of a trailblazer for blockchain deployments and using it for our own efficiency improvement in the way we manage government services. So briefly, we launched 3 initiatives to tackle all these aspects. We launched the EU Observatory and Forum, which is about, I mean, this is a very, very complex world. There's a lot happening, a lot of new projects, etc. So the observatory helps us to map all the initiatives in Europe related to blockchain, but as well they'll help us in analyzing deeply into these challenges related to compliance to law. That's why they first looked at blockchain and GDPR. Blockchain innovation in Europe, government services on blockchain. These are 3 thematic reports that were produced. And others are coming about important topics that were briefly mentioned: interoperability, scalability, and sustainability of blockchain. We talked about energy efficiency of blockchain solutions. We want as well, if this is going to be a foundational technology for the next generation internet, to have interoperability between systems. And then we're going to analyze as well the legal challenges with blockchain, especially related to smart contracts. And there's a workshop organized in Paris on the 12th of December, which is open to other experts to participate, where we're going to really look into this deeply. Then another initiative, which is quite important, is the European Blockchain Partnership, where the Commission proposed the member states on a voluntary basis to sign cooperation agreement with the Commission to start analyzing and the possibility to deploy a European blockchain services infrastructure in a first stage to provide cross-border government services. That's what I say, trying to improve the way we deal with the citizens and with the stakeholders and how we provide our services using the features of blockchain of transparency, auditability, etc. And so we are really, we had several meetings with the member states, and we need for the end of this year, and we're close, to agree on the use cases we're going to deploy on that infrastructure, the governance of it, and as well to define the vision of that infrastructure and the technical specification, because we count to start deployments next year. So in terms of use cases, we have one which is quite emblematic, I think. It's about university certificates. We're still dealing with paper copies and authenticated copies of our university degrees or high school degrees, and the idea is really to digitalize that process on the blockchain, to anchor the university certificates on the blockchain through the universities, and then the user and the citizen can use them to present it to employers. We have one use case which is about self-sovereign identity and helping citizens to get back control of their private data. Another one proposed by European Court of Auditors, the auditability aspect of the blockchain, which is about, I mean, the Commission and the public authorities are huge funds providers, grants in research, in innovations, in developments, in regional funding, and the possibility to register the transactions related to fund management would give the European Court of Auditor a very good way to audit the way they are distributed. And then the third aspect is that, as I said, we would like to have interoperable systems in the future. Open source doesn't guarantee interoperability. So we are contributing to standardization. We are participating to the ISO Technical Committee on blockchain, and we're working with the European standards organizations on blockchain as well. And then another rule that we have is that, as I said, we provide funding, and so in our research and innovation program, Horizon 2020, we have already committed or on the way to commit up to 300 million euros related to blockchain piloting, deployments, etc. We are securing some more for the next program called Horizon Europe. There will be another program called the Digital Europe program, which is about the digitization of the economy, and there as well we'd like to have a chunk of it for blockchain deployments. And there will be as well that we're working on a funding instrument to fund research and developments in AI and blockchain. So this is more or less what we're doing on a regulatory perspective, but as well as a policy initiative more generally and deployment.
And it sounds like a lot of activity. I mean, how many people within the Commission are working in the kind of blockchain project?
There's a core team working 100% on the blockchain, and there are more and more now people working partly. So we have DG Connect, which is leading the policy initiative. We have for the deployments, we're going to have Digit. We have our joint research center as well, undertaking studies and research on blockchain. Then we have our early adopters internally, DG Taxut, because they really very early identify the possibility to use blockchain in the huge systems they're using for VAT management and the custom, the entry and exit of goods in the single market, etc. So they're huge distributed systems, and they see the potential for blockchain to facilitate the process and to save costs.
So quite a lot of people. John, I realize you can't speak on behalf of the US government, but I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of activity going on in Brussels. Do you see that in Washington as well? Is there a lot of interest in this area on a regulatory level?
There is. I think where some of the innovation is happening, or perhaps most of it, is on a state-by-state level. So there are at least 2 states that I'm aware of that have started investigating blockchain in ways that it can be used in government processes. But I'm not that familiar on the regulatory side with what's going on in the United States.
Okay.
I wish I could add more.
So I want to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned, which were standardization and interoperability. I don't know if you want to say a bit more about that, or maybe Erich. I mean, do you think these are important issues? Perhaps Erich could go first, and then...
Yeah, I think standardization, interoperability are important, yet to be found what needs to be standardized and what needs to interoperate. I think, as Benoit very nicely mentioned, there is actually a lot of moving parts into that, and if you go too quickly into regulating and actually standardizing, then we might actually not have the innovation that we need going forward. So I think the challenge with all those topics that we're talking about, whether it's regulation or standardization, it's really that, like, how much do you let happen to see what's the next thing versus how much do you actually clamp down right now? And I think, it's interesting to see, for example, that Bitcoin was, as we saw, the first crypto assets out there, and therefore the first blockchain. And then you have the birth of Ethereum. Right now in the market, there's actually a lot of talks on, is this the thing, or is it something that's going to be, like Netscape, and then it's gone? And then there's actually talks of new chains that are coming up, such as Definity, Neos, and so on and so forth. So it's also difficult to figure out what would need to be standardized, and I think that's where words of cautions are needed. The same goes for actually regulation. And right now, the state we're in is not great because there is actually a lot of arbitrage in terms of regulation. And if you look at it, small states such as Malta or Bermuda are taking very innovative leap of faith and thinking, this is huge. You can actually attract a lot of innovation in our countries, and you can do a lot of things. And so they're pushing forward for actually accepting these technologies and giving a way in. Yet, is that the right way? And I think the question also that Benoit raised on that, when and how do you regulate, and what path do you take? And I think it's interesting to think through back of the internet, right? If we had regulated the internet too early, maybe we wouldn't have seen some of the players. Yet, if we had regulated some of the things earlier, then we wouldn't have the massive centralization that we have right now, and now we have to catch up with regulations such as GDPR. So I think all those questions are extremely important, and the state we're in right now, which is still trying to figure out what needs to be standardized, what needs to interoperate, and what should be regulated is important.
Is now the time to be having these discussions, or should we wait until things are a bit more developed?
No, I think it's definitely now the time to have it because it's complex. And I love also what you said at the beginning. Maybe 6 months ago, 2 people understood it, and now 3 people understand it. I always find it interesting when someone defines themselves as an expert in that field. I think it's quite challenging, right? So we need to think right now of all those implications, and we need to start thinking through what will it mean for society, what will it mean for the world that we want to design, knowing that we might not have yet the answers. And I think we also need to be ready for, in particular, if I think through regulation, having something that could work today and then maybe in a week or in a month, it might not work. I think something interesting, we engage a lot with local governments, whether in the US, in Asia, or in Europe. And stablecoin, to give a concrete example, is not something that was on anyone's radar 6 months ago, but not even in the industry. And now it's one thing that we talk about, and we say, oh, we thought we had a taxonomy, and there's this new thing coming through. And that's the reality of that market, right? So I think we need to talk now to make sure that there is a common understanding of actually what are the challenges and the thing we need to think through. Because again, coming from an industry perspective, we're not going to think the same necessarily way, right? But we need to, I think, educate both sides to actually make sure that what we design going forward is going to be what society needs.
Benoit.
If I may add a bit on that. So as I said, we need to be cautious of not regulating too early, but the reality is there that there are already now regulations in Malta, in Gibraltar as well, which is not going to be EU in a few, I mean, we'll see. But still, it's there. So in our DNA as a European Commission, our DNA is to avoid market fragmentation, avoiding having, 28 national legislations which are not going to be compatible, etc. So it's really time to...
Do we need an international agreement that goes beyond Europe?
I mean, the more you can harmonize, the best it is. But we're focusing on Europe, which is already complex enough, and then we'll see for the rest. But yes, I mean, there are talks between regulators, etc., on issues like ICOs and taxonomies, etc. But coming back on standardization, so it's time. Really, the reality is there that legislations are coming into place, and France is working on one as well. In terms of standardization, there was a lot of debate before the ISO created a technical committee on blockchain. Is it too early or not, etc. We know the technology is not completely mature, but it's never too early to start working. Then issuing standards is another thing, but at least working on terminologies, working on a reference architecture for blockchain, etc., which are, I mean, the ISO Technical Committee is embracing all the different topics we're addressing today, interoperability, smart contracts, governance, use cases, security, privacy, etc. it's never too early to start the work. Of course, then is it mature enough to issue standards? No, definitely not. But the first one are going to come in 2020, and the earlier we're going to have standards, and the earlier the adoption of the technology is going to be made easier, etc. And so working on standardization, it's work in progress. It's important. It has started, and we need to put the focus on that, yes. Okay. And as well as once again a European entity, we need as well to identify whether there are not European specificities to blockchain deployments. We talked about legislations. There's a bunch of legislations, GDPR, EIDAS, I said, NIS, anti-money laundering, etc. And we may have specificities about blockchain deployments that we need to tackle as well, and maybe standardized. So the SEN has issued a white paper. Etsy has created an industry study group on blockchain, and then we're working as well. I mean, we're following ITU, IPwe, etc. There's a lot going on in standardization, and we need to facilitate that and to make sure that whatever standards arise is good for Europe.
Okay, thank you. So we'll park those issues about standardization and interoperability just for the moment, and maybe come back to them in the questions if there's interest. One of the other things we want to look at in this panel is smart contracts, and clearly how they work and what the connection is with blockchain. John, I think you've got some views on this.
Yeah, sure. I'll start with attempting to give a definition of smart contracts. But first, smart contracts are an old concept. They've been around for over 2 decades, and from what I can tell, the term appears to have been coined here in the Netherlands, actually, by a cryptographer named Nick Szabo at the University of Amsterdam back in 1996. And he defined a smart contract as a set of promises specified in digital form and including protocols within which the parties perform on those promises. And 1996, you'll probably recognize, was at kind of the dawn, or at least the early stages of internet commerce, and smart contracts became ubiquitous. We use one, we implement a smart contract every time we click and purchase something on Amazon. But the term has now, and the idea of the smart contract with the all of the innovation that's going on in blockchain has all of a sudden become a hot topic again. So I'm going to offer maybe a simpler definition of a smart contract, and then just 3 quick observations on that. One simple definition that I've seen that seems to be fairly common is that it is an agreement in digital form that is self-executing and self-enforcing. And 3 observations on that. First, if you'll pardon the pun, there's no consensus on the definition of what a smart contract is. If you Google it or look at it, you'll get many, many different definitions. Second, most definitions of smart contract do not take into account the legal aspects of an actual contract, which at least in the US and in the UK, and I assume there are analogs in Europe, require offer, consideration, acceptance, and a meeting of the minds of the parties, and then taking into account both the capacity of the parties to contract and the legality of the contract. So this definition of smart contract and this concept often doesn't take into account at all the legal definition of the term contract. And then my third observation is that because they are self-executing and self-enforcing, they are certainly not smart. So we're left with a bit of an oxymoron, like military intelligence. A smart contract is typically neither a contract nor is it smart. So, before we start talking about them, I think we have to have kind of that background understood. They've been around a long time. They typically are not taking into account the legal aspects, and they're not smart until we bring in the AI aspects of it, perhaps.
And what does that change if you bring in AI?
Well, I think there you can start to have some maybe real-time analysis of a contract, and when you put it onto a blockchain and you have the consensus mechanism starting to work, then you actually have some decisions to be made on whether to enforce and perform the contract. So I think that's where the integration of AI and smart contracts and blockchain are all going to come together to transact in ways that are ultimately legally enforceable.
And so will a blockchain enable smart contracts to be smart and contracts in the way that they're, as you described, they've not been so far?
Yeah, not in and of itself, I think. That will come with the integration of AI into it. And I think making a contract smart. So there are a number of reasons why you would want to put a contract on a blockchain, and not, and Marika touched on this as well. Not every contract needs to be on a blockchain. If I go up to a vending machine, I'm executing a smart contract. I select my product, I put in my coins, and I get my candy bar. But do we care if that is a legally enforceable contract? Does that need to be on a blockchain? Do we care where the candy bar came from? Do we care if it's an insane person that's putting in the coins who might not be able to effect a legal contract? No, we don't. But there are, I think, three reasons why you would want to implement a contract on a smart chain, and they are linked to the characteristics we're all familiar with blockchain. So that's the immutability of the record, the inability to alter the record, provenance, or the concept of chronology of ownership, and also consensus, or the trust mechanisms that are built into play. And three, well, I'll give just four really quick examples of where you would want to put perhaps implement a smart contract on a blockchain. One, where the chronology of ownership is crucial. Like I said, it may not be crucial for a candy bar that's going to be ultimately eaten, but for a patent, you want the chronology of ownership to be very clear for the title of your car or your property. Second, and Marika touched on this as well as an example, where you want to know the original source of the good that's being traded. So the blood diamond problem, I've seen a use case for wine. So making sure that the grapes were actually harvested in the Loire Valley, or somewhere nice like that. Transactions that require strong verification of identity. So who am I dealing with? And then bringing in this concept of know your customer. You can have very strong verification of identity with blockchain. That's where you might want to integrate that with smart contracts. And last, transactions where you don't trust the central authority. So would you want to contract in, say, in Venezuela, where there is, pretty close to a failed government? Maybe not, but if you can get rid of that central authority and put it onto a blockchain, then that's a good place where you would want to have smart contracts in play.
Very interesting, yeah. And you're a lawyer. From a lawyer's point of view, does smart contracts put you out of business, or do they generate new challenges for you?
New challenges, I would say. Definitely not out of business, because contract law is typically remedial in nature, right? You bring in aspects of contract law when things go wrong, and there are I think some legal aspects that are not going to go away, or that may be impediments to contracting on a blockchain. One is this idea of capacity to contract. The very young cannot make legal contracts. The insane cannot make legal contracts. But to enter into a smart contract on a blockchain, typically you just need a private key. So do you know who you are dealing with? And it brings in issues of both pseudonymity and anonymity into contracts. If all you need is a private key to enter into the contract, do the parties have capacity? You need consideration for a contract. Typically that's money, but can it be a token? And what prevents somebody from encoding into a smart chain a simple promise or a gift without consideration that's not legally enforceable? And finally, because these are self-executing and self-enforcing, at least most of the lawyers in the room will be familiar with the concept of efficient breach of contract, right? Say I'm in a lease agreement in an apartment, but I have to move. And so now it's efficient for both, perhaps for both me and the landlord, if I breach the contract and stop paying my rent. And, you know, if these are self-executing and self-enforcing, are there ways to kind of break out of the, you know, the transaction in an efficient way if that's the way it's being done? So I think there are a lot of legal considerations. If you want your smart contract to actually be a contract that's going to be legally enforceable, you have to take care of these things up front. And I don't think these issues will go away, or at least not anytime soon.
Okay. Erich, do you have any views on smart contracts? Do you agree with what John said? You've got a background in law and finance as well, I think. So smart contracts make an impact?
I see it a little different in the sense that I think that the most important thing that'll happen, at least in the patent space, is that this will be an impetus to standardization. So take a license agreement, for example. So the easiest piece to make smart is payment. You know, either it happened or it didn't happen. The little trickier piece to put in the contract is that, you know, I license to Sally, and Sally has to act reasonably, and Sally doesn't act reasonably. The code doesn't know how to measure that. But what you can do is you can have that, say, default to, you know, arbitration in Ireland or whatever. So, but I think the most important thing you'll see near term is that people in the patent space, and this has to happen. I've done 1,500 license agreements in the last 12 years, and every single time I send one out, the lawyer on the other side feels compelled to comment on the most inane things. And so much like your mortgage, when you go to the bank, you know, go in and good luck negotiating your mortgage, this will finally be something that will happen where the ability to negotiate over points that shouldn't happen. And what happens when that happens? It becomes more efficient, it becomes less painful, more business people will want to engage in it, and so it'll be a good thing. So I don't think it will be this magic thing where you hit a button and automatically license agreements will happen, but what will happen is components of it will become far more efficient. As it becomes more efficient, more of them will happen because there's less friction in the system.
They'll become more transparent as well.
Yeah, more transparent.
But isn't there resistance to transparency in this sector?
Yeah, it doesn't begin to describe resistance as whatever the higher word is than resistance, complete opposition. So I think that's the thing that people will start to come into, and what will happen is I think that push is actually going to come from the top down, where at the non-legal level, where people just start to realize this is a much more efficient way to transact, even though it's not going to be a pure smart contract in the Bitcoin context or something like that.
Any comments from this side of the panel on smart contracts? You mentioned smart contracts in your remarks earlier. But
as I said, of course, this topic is very important from a legal perspective. If I may add to what was already, I'm not a lawyer, but I think that we have to distinguish between different cases. You have the case where the smart contract is just a digitalization of a contract which already exists between the parties outside the blockchain. That's probably the easiest case. But really the trouble can come when the automatic execution of the smart contracts leads to unforeseen results which were not previously agreed, etc. What happens in that case? What is the legal recognition of smart contracts, whatever that means, and we have to define that. If a court decides to go back to the original situation after the execution of contract, as the blockchain is immutable, how can we do that? Because at the end of the day, it's going to be the court who decides, right? I know there were that debate about the code is the law is the code, but I think that liability, if something wrong happens with the execution of the contract, whether it's due to a bug or whatsoever, who's liable? What is the applicable law? Blockchains are distributed by nature, so you have nodes a bit everywhere. So what is the applicable law when there's an issue? So all of these points and issues need to be carefully analyzed and see what we can do with them and give clarity to the stakeholders as well and the implementers, so that they feel safe when they deploy blockchain solution, that what they do is according to laws.
And Erich, do you think that industry needs that clarity on smart contracts?
Yeah, definitely. I'll start saying I loved your definitions, John. I never thought about it, but smart contracts are not smart and not contracts. That's definitely food for thought. But joke aside, I think it shows the importance. It actually shows the importance of clear definition and what is it used for, where is it used for, what's the purpose, what is this thing trying to do. And I think this whole conversation and the points that were raised made me thought about maybe something that didn't come through as much in the presentation, but we touched upon algorithmic stable coins and this idea that out there are basically people trying to figure out what if we replaced with AI and smart contracts the role of a central banks and therefore the role of actually printing money and putting money into circulations and figuring out what is the inflation rate. If you really extrapolate that, the role of central banks is with a lot of extremely smart economists and mathematicians to figure out what inflation rate should be. And therefore, could you put that into smart contracts and completely automate that? And I think the idea in itself is extremely interesting, but then the consequences of that idea and the actually definitions of where it falls through and if something goes wrong, like who's actually responsible for that, are probably not there yet. So I think definitely, some of the other questions that were raised is, do we need clear definitions? We do. Do we need to start talking about it now? We definitely do. Are lawyers out of business? I think right now they're probably more in business than ever because there is like a lot of clarity that is needed through all of that.
So good news for any lawyers in the room then. Okay, so we've touched on smart contracts. Again, if you have any questions, we'll take questions in 5 minutes or so, and you can bring them up then. We thought we'd just use the 5 minutes before the questions just to look at some of the bigger issues around blockchain. And Marieke, I wanted to pick up in particular, I think, on what you both mentioned in your presentation about the mass adoption of blockchain, or the lack of mass adoption so far, and what needs to happen for blockchain to be really taken up more broadly across society, and is that about understanding? Is it about implementation, accessibility? What do you think is the key?
Yeah, I think actually the first real key is something really usable, right? So it's something that is actually user-friendly and that people can relate to and can actually start using. I don't know how many of you were actually familiar with the concept of crypto kitties, but I was quite fascinated by it when it happened.
Crypto kitties.
Crypto kitties, I'll explain. So everything starts with cats, whether it's like YouTube video or whatever, everything starts with cats. But joke aside, there was this group of very smart coders who started putting together, what if actually you can create your own digitalized version of a cat and you can breed that and you can give it certain attributes and then you can actually exchange that for a certain value, and there's only one of those cats. Like, I know it's a bit weird, but stay with me. And I thought that first concept was interesting because actually a flurry of people went into it more like as a gaming opportunity, and it's a game, right? I can have my own cat, I can breed it, and then I can exchange it. To me, that was the first thing that I thought, okay, there is something there that if you extrapolate for digital art, then you could really do something. And then what could happen actually with just that exchange of I've created a picture, it's really my picture, and no one can actually use it unless they actually give me rights and send me a small token for that. But that's the one that we really heard about that made really a lot of noise, at least in our community. And I think right now what is lacking is that, it's like that real use case that people don't need to know it's actually running on blockchain, and they just see something that is extremely useful, helpful, and actually makes it easier, faster, cheaper, and more transparent. And to get there, in our view, when we've seen, this graph that showed like a lot of bubbles explode, when you see 2013 burst of Bitcoin, 2015 burst of Ethereum, 2017, 2018, like bursts of like lots of smart contracts, whether they're smart or not, and contracts or not. And then what we think will happen in 2019 is actually a lot of building, right? We need to build strong applications, and then that, anyone in the street can actually start using without needing to know actually that it's blockchain empowered and that it is actually there's technology behind, but seeing that it actually brings real value.
Do you think blockchain has a kind of branding problem, that people just hear blockchain and think, oh, that's something complicated, I don't understand it, and maybe it's a little bit dangerous?
I think people do, but so did people with the internet. And I remember when I was working in the retail industry back then, and no one was ever going to buy any goods on the internet. Look where we are now. So I think it's the same stigma, and I think that will take a long time, and probably it will take many, many more years to be solved. And I think it's normal. I think it's actually quite a good thing to have that, because it forces also the industry to think carefully through all the implications. And yeah, one of actually our job is to make sure that it can be understood, it can be brought mainstream, can be simplified, but yet stay still correct.
Benoît?
Yeah, if I may add a bit on what we could do to have a mass adoption of blockchain quicker, or to facilitate it. I told about the legal certainty, so I think as public authorities we need to work on that. As I said, we are working on it. And for example, the regulatory sandboxes or innovation hubs that have been created in some countries, etc., to help the startups and the innovators to launch their products and be as well safe and monitored by the regulatory authorities, which could then as well learn on what's happening on the market, etc. This is one of the ways as well to provide that legal certainty for innovators to be able to launch new products and services. We talked about the availability and use of standards, and then later on they're used in public procurement. This is one of the policy initiatives we have in ICT at the Commission, to push public authorities to refer to standards in public procurement so that you can diffuse innovation. And then availability of a trusted infrastructure. That's why we think there's a need to deploy something like the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure, which would be trusted, secure, and would satisfy a certain number of guiding principles, privacy, etc., and authentication of people using it, etc. And then a leading role of public authorities by adopting the technology through innovation, procurement, etc., could as well help and facilitate the adoption of the technology.
Okay. As I say, we don't want to trespass too much on the territory of the next panel, but it's just interesting to get your perspectives on the role of IP rights in blockchain. I mean, you're a business, Erich. Have you filed patents at IPwe?
Yeah, I think we have 22 or 23 on file.
Okay. And whereabouts are they filed?
U.S.
US. Okay. And do you? I mean, well, clearly you think they're important for the business, but why? And why are you filing patents?
Look, I mean, I'm a fundamental believer in the patent system, so I can read all I like, and actually, by and large, I'm very much against the government helping me. But on this particular point, I do think it is a way to attract capital, and I think that people get comfortable with it from both a freedom to operate perspective and from a potential blocking perspective. So I continue to believe that they are important. For all their shortcomings, and there are many, and I agree, they still serve a critical function in the economy.
And do you think we'll see much litigation over blockchain patents? Will we have blockchain patent wars like we did with smartphones?
Look, I mean, history tells you yes, right? So when any time, whether it's a sewing machine, a car, a train, an airplane, whatever you want to pick, or smartphone, but I think it's going to be. Yeah, I'd like to think no, actually, on this particular one, and just because of the fundamental difference of the technology, but my crystal ball is no better than yours.
And what's the perspective from the US? Are you seeing it? I mean, we saw the statistics in the earlier presentation. Are you seeing that in practice? A lot of applications around blockchain?
Yes, a lot of patenting activity in the United States. And one additional, statistic, we see, yes, IBM is getting a lot of patents, and the fintech companies are getting a lot of patents. But there are also, we found a large number of small entities filing, single patent applications, over 400 by one survey that we internally did. And of course, those, one robust patent application, which is what we try to procure for our clients, can spawn a patent family. So There are, in addition to a lot of patent activities from the usual suspects, there is a lot of activity from small entities in the United States. So tremendous amount of innovation, and my sense it is largely innovation around use cases, and I think this is a good thing. And I think we sense in the blockchain innovation community in the U.S. a very strong anti-patent, open source ethos, so to speak, especially for the kind of the foundational technology. We see it at conferences we attend, and that seems to, there is a desire to actively avoid smartphone wars or some analog to that.
And have you seen any litigation yet in the blockchain area?
No.
Do you anticipate seeing any?
I agree with Erich. It might be inevitable, but if it is, hopefully it's not in kind of these foundational technologies, but rather in use cases and competing at that level versus cryptographic algorithms. But remember, the foundational technology has been out in the wild for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And it may be too early to say, but have you seen any obstacles from the patent office so far to patenting these kind of things? Or
In the U.S., a lot more than here in Europe, yes.
Yeah.
Namely Alice.
Yeah, so they fall foul of that.